Technology never stands still. What once seemed like a breakthrough and a sensation eventually becomes forgotten, and sometimes even hidden from our eyes. In this video, I invite you to explore 5 man-made objects located deep underground, underwater, and even beneath the ice. Enjoy watching. Every major country has its share of secret projects from the past, some of which remain shrouded in secrecy even today. One such project for the Soviet Union was the Accelerator Storage Complex of the Institute for High Energy Physics. This massive, powerful collider remains underground just 100 kilometers from Moscow. The Soviet collider was impressive in scale, comparable to the Large Hadron Collider, LH. Its underground ring spanned 21 kilometers, with the main tunnel's diameter reaching 5 meters at depths of 20 to 60 meters. Alongside the main structure, numerous auxiliary facilities connected to the surface by vertical shafts were also constructed. The project promised to become the first and largest experimental facility of its kind in the world. However, the Soviet collider was destined to remain underground, never operational. In 1960, the Soviet government decided to establish the Institute for High Energy Physics. To this end, a secret settlement named Serpukhov 7 was founded 100 kilometers from the capital. The site in the forest near Moscow was not chosen randomly, as this area had been a sea in ancient times. This geological feature allowed the placement of large underground structures well protected from seismic activity. In 1965, Serpukhov 7 was renamed the urban-type settlement of Protvino after the local Protva River. 2 years later, a Proton synchrotron, the U-70, was launched at the Institute, achieving an energy of 70 GeV. It remains the highest energy accelerator in Russia to this day. Soon, scientists realized they had reached great heights in high-energy physics, leading to the decision to begin work on an ambitious project, a proton-proton collider with an energy of 3 TeV. This collider was set to become the largest and most powerful in the world. The project was led by academician Anatoly Logunov. The collider's design involved 2 stages. The first stage would take a 70 GeV proton beam from the U-70 accelerator and increase its energy to an intermediate level of 400 to 600 GeV. In the second stage, the proton's energy would be raised to the maximum level. Both stages were to be housed within a massive ring-shaped tunnel. Construction of the tunnel began in 1983 but progressed slowly due to the lack of modern construction equipment. To accelerate the process, in 1987, the Soviet government purchased 2 tunnel boring machines from the Canadian company Lovat. These 150-ton machines were capable of precise drilling and lining the tunnel walls with a 30-centimeter layer of concrete reinforced with metal insulation. Their use significantly sped up the tunneling process. By the end of 1989, about 70% of the main ring tunnel and 95% of the injection channel designed to transfer the beam from the U-70 to the Accelerator Storage Complex were completed. Additionally, 3 engineering buildings were constructed and over 20 industrial sites were under development. The project was moving full steam ahead. However, funding for the project was significantly reduced that same year, coinciding with the dissolution of the USSR. In 1991, funding was cut off entirely, leaving the project's fate uncertain. Abandoning the complex was not an option, as it would eventually be flooded by groundwater, negatively impacting the region's ecology. Therefore, it was decided to close the underground ring. This task took another 4 years, but work on the accelerator itself fell far behind. By then, only about 75% of the first stage's accelerating structure and a few dozen superconducting magnets were completed, far short of the 2,500 magnets required. As a result, the injector tunnel was the only part of the complex that was finished. There was still hope for reviving the project. However, 2 events dashed these hopes. The first was the 1998 financial crisis in Russia, which left insufficient funds not only to continue construction, but also to pay workers' wages. The second blow came with the opening of the Large Hadron Collider, LHC, in 2008. The LHC was more powerful and advanced than the Soviet design, rendering the Accelerator Storage Complex obsolete. Continuing work on the collider became pointless. Abandoning it was also not an option. Thus, federal funds are still allocated annually to maintain the complex, including guarding the site and pumping water from the tunnels. Meanwhile, other, more modest projects at the Institute for High Energy Physics in Protvino, including the U-70 accelerator, remain operational. Russian scientists continue to build on their achievements, pursuing new high-energy physics projects. Treasure hunters often dedicate decades of their lives searching for treasures, yet they don't always find something truly valuable. Sometimes, unique items are discovered on private property, where landowners refuse to allow research. Such was the case for an American enthusiast named David Hawley. In July 1987, Hawley began searching for an extraordinary object. Using a proton magnetometer, he conducted his research on a cornfield owned by farmer Norman Sorter. At a depth of about 14 meters, Hawley detected a massive object, convinced he had found what he was looking for. All that remained was to negotiate with the owner of the cornfield to start excavations. However, when Hawley shared his findings with Sorter, the farmer flatly refused, citing potential financial losses. Sorter also tried to uncover what had sparked Hawley's interest, but the researcher withheld details. Eventually, the farmer agreed to allow excavations under one condition. Hawley had to promise him 15% of the proceeds from the find. Excavations on the cornfield began a year later, in 1988. What they found more than 14 meters underground shocked not only Sorter, but the public as well. This story begins in 1853 when a steamboat called Arabia was built at the Pringle Boat Building Company in the American city of Brownsville. The Arabia was a cargo passenger paddle steamer and a true giant for its time. The ship's hull was 55 meters long and it had a carrying capacity of over 230 tons. It was equipped with a wood-piered boiler that consumed about 30 cords of wood per day, while traveling at a speed of around 5 knots against the current. Initially, the Arabia was owned by 3 individuals, Adam Jacob, George Reed, and Nicholas Schrenger, but in 1855, it was sold to Captain John Shaw. Under his ownership, the steamboat began navigating the Missouri River. During this time, it became embroiled in a scandal when weapons intended for abolitionists were discovered on board during the Civil War. However, this incident was soon forgotten, and the Arabia resumed its voyages. By 1856, misfortune seemed to follow the Arabia. First, the ship collided with a floating log and narrowly avoided sinking. After repairs, its steam cylinder exploded. Despite these setbacks, Shaw continued to operate the vessel, which completed at least 14 trips between St. Louis and upstream destinations within 6 months. Navigating the Missouri River was highly profitable, but also risky. The river was notorious for its floating debris and submerged trees. Furthermore, the riverbed was covered with thick layers of silt. Even during the day, it was difficult for sailors to steer clear of obstacles. Many failed, and by the 19th century, over 400 steamboats had sunk in the Missouri River. The Arabia was one of them. On August 30th, 1856, the Arabia departed from St. Louis for Sioux City. On board were 130 people and a large cargo load. On September 5th, the steamboat made a brief stop in Kansas City. An hour after departing, near the bend of Quindaro, the Arabia struck a walnut tree trunk. The impact was so strong that passengers and crew were thrown off their feet. The tree trunk had pierced the wooden hull, penetrating 3 meters into the ship. Panic erupted among those on board. The men managed to jump into the sole lifeboat and reach the shore. Regaining their composure, they returned to the steamboat to rescue the remaining passengers. Fortunately, everyone on board survived and was saved. The Arabia, however, sank less than 12 hours after the collision, taking its valuable cargo with it to the riverbed. Insurance companies deemed it impractical to recover the goods and began payouts 4 days after the wreck. When news of the Arabia's sinking spread across Missouri, treasure hunters began searching for the lost ship. This wasn't without reason. The ship was believed to carry many valuable goods, including around 400 kegs of whiskey. The situation reached absurd proportions, with treasure hunters spending large sums in hopes of striking it rich, often with disappointing results. For instance, Robert Treadway and Henry Tobner spent $2,000 trying to retrieve the ship, but managed to recover only 1 crate of felt hats. Over time, the excitement surrounding the Arabia's valuable cargo faded. The ship might have been forgotten entirely if not for its discovery on Norman Sorter's cornfield. Still, one question remained. How did a steamboat that sank in the Missouri River end up buried 14 meters underground on private land? It turns out that by the late 19th century, the Missouri River's course near the site of the Arabia's collision had shifted by nearly a kilometer, forming a new bend near the Kansas City suburbs. By then, the steamboat had already been buried under thick layers of river sediment, which over time became part of the land. When David Hawley conducted his research on Norman Sorter's cornfield, he was indeed searching for the Arabia. He deliberately avoided revealing his purpose, hoping to recover the valuable cargo and sell it for a profit. After the steamboat was excavated, researchers discovered a wealth of goods on board. These included canned vegetables, cheese, coffee, cigars, cosmetics, medicines, ceramics, weapons, and numerous barrels of various alcoholic beverages. Initially, Hawley planned to sell the recovered cargo, but since most of it consisted of food products, he decided against selling individual items. Instead, he founded the Arabia Steamboat Museum in Kansas. In exchange for allowing the excavation, farmer Norman Sorter received 25 valuable items, which he gifted to his grandchildren. In 2010, Russian media reported that the D-1 Dekabrist submarine, which had disappeared in 1940, was discovered in Motovsky Bay at a depth of over 250 meters. However, the news lacked in details about the incident, leaving the mystery unsolved. The Dekabrist-class submarines were the first large Soviet torpedo diesel-electric multi-purpose submarines. Their construction was essential for strengthening the Soviet fleet after the October Revolution. At that time, the Soviet Union lacked sufficient expertise in designing such submarines, making the task a significant challenge for the engineers. Boris Malinin, a naval architect, was appointed as the project leader. Despite having a team of only 6 people, he and his team managed to turn the seemingly impossible into reality. On March 5, 1927, a significant event took place at the Baltic shipyard in Leningrad, the laying of the keel for the Dekabrist submarine D-1. The ceremony was a formal affair attended by high-ranking officials. The Dekabrist class included 6 submarines, with the D-1 being the first. By 1930, it was commissioned into the Baltic Sea Fleet. Following some upgrades, the submarine undertook several long-range missions, including voyages to the White Sea, the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, and Cape Nordkapp. The D-1 also played an important role during the Soviet-Finnish War, completing 3 combat patrols near the Norwegian port city of Vardø. Its commander, Yeltyshev, was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his service. After the war, the D-1 remained in operation. On November 13, 1940, its crew was scheduled to participate in a training exercise. The mission involved conducting a practice torpedo attack on a ship after passing underneath its keel. On the first day, the maneuver was to be practiced, followed by the attack during joint operations with the floating base Umba the next day. Such exercises were routine, and no one anticipated any issues until the unthinkable happened. At 8:55 a.m. on November 13, 1940, the D-1 departed from Polyarny and set a course for Motovsky Bay. At 1:26 p.m., the Dekabrist's commander reported arriving at training ground number 6 and being ready to begin the exercise. The training mission was successfully completed, and the Umba returned to base. Coastal observation posts tracked the submarine. At 1:45 p.m., observers reported seeing the D-1's periscope, but shortly afterward, the submarine vanished from sight and its commander ceased communications. It became clear that a tragedy had occurred, prompting an immediate search operation. The search involved an Embar-2 seaplane, minesweepers, and the rescue tug Pamyat Ruslana. Members of a special commission led by the Deputy People's Commissar of the Navy for Shipbuilding Lev Galler also arrived at the scene. Soon after, large oil slicks, wooden debris, and fragments of cork insulation were found near the area where the submarine had submerged. It seemed likely that the D-1 had sunk, but the reasons remained unclear. To determine the cause, the submarine needed to be located and raised to the surface. However, on November 26, 1940, all search operations were halted, and the commission concluded that the D-1, along with its 55-member crew, had perished due to the pressure, hull's destruction after descending below its maximum depth. With the search for the D-1 abandoned and the submarine never recovered, experts could only speculate about the cause of the disaster. The official explanation was that the submarine exceeded its maximum depth, possibly due to technical failure or crew error. However, many experts disagreed and proposed alternative theories. Some believed that another submarine in Motovsky Bay might have sunk the D-1. Others speculated that underwater mines in the bay could have caused the disaster. Another theory suggested the Dekabrist was accidentally rammed by a German ship departing from the Nord base. Many have wondered why the search for the submarine was discontinued, fueling suspicions that the Soviet government may have intentionally concealed details of the incident. While this theory cannot be ruled out, it is also important to consider the geographical and environmental challenges of Motovsky Bay. Despite its relatively small size, the bay features significant depths and a complex seabed. The submarine's wreckage could have fallen into deep crevices, and strong currents might have quickly buried it under layers of silt and sand, making recovery efforts seem futile. Although reports in 2018 claim that the D-1 submarine had been found, no operations to examine the site of its sinking were conducted. Thus, the reasons for this tragedy remain a mystery to this day. In 1988, Icelandic engineers and geophysicists were conducting research on the eastern coast of Greenland. Using advanced radar technology, they detected 8 large objects buried beneath an 80-meter-thick layer of ice. They reported their discovery to scientists, but the latter, after analyzing the data, insisted that nothing man-made could exist under such a thick layer of ice. Despite the skepticism, the Icelandic specialists remained intrigued by their discovery and decided to investigate independently. To determine what lay beneath the ice, they used a homemade steam probe. Using this device, the engineers managed to melt through the ice. Imagine their shock when they found a flying machine beneath it. This discovery challenged the prevailing belief that it would take thousands of years for such a thick layer of ice to form. Attempts to build flying machines date back to the 16th century. The first notable success came from the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph Michel and Jacques Etienne, who constructed a hot air balloon in 783. However, the first airplane prototypes only began to appear in the 19th century. The idea that an aircraft, potentially over 1,000 years old, could lie beneath Greenland's ice sounded like pure science fiction. The sensational discovery caught the attention of American aircraft dealer Patrick Epps and his friend Richard Taylor. Years earlier, Epps had been searching for missing P-38 fighter planes and B-17 bombers from 1942. He was convinced that the geophysicists had found these variant aircraft. Epps contacted the Icelandic researchers and obtained the coordinates of their discovery. In 1989, he and Taylor traveled to Greenland, hoping to confirm their theory and recover at least one plane. Upon reaching the site, Epps realized the task was nearly impossible. Excavating or blasting through such a massive amount of ice was impractical. Returning home, Epps and Taylor began devising a plan to retrieve the aircraft. In 1990, they embarked on another expedition to Greenland, this time equipped with a device called the Super Gopher. This machine stood about 1.5 meters tall and was wrapped in copper coils through which hot water flowed. Using it, Epps and Taylor began melting a shaft through the ice at a rate of about 50 centimeters per hour. When the device nearly reached the wing of a B-17 bomber, they applied hot water, but the aircraft couldn't withstand the pressure and was destroyed. Epps and Taylor returned empty-handed. However, this setback didn't deter them. A month later, they realized that the B-17 bomber was significantly less durable than the P-38 fighter planes. This time, they decided to focus on retrieving one of the fighters. In May 1992, they returned to Greenland once again. As they had hoped, the P-38 was in near-perfect condition beneath the ice. Over several weeks, Epps, Taylor, and their team managed to extract the wings and fuselage of the fighter. Most importantly, they succeeded in their mission. 6 months later, in Kentucky, the disassembled P-38 was meticulously restored. The reconstruction was successful, and, to everyone's amazement, the aircraft was in excellent condition. The pilot's cockpit was untouched, and all the instruments and weapons functioned perfectly. On October 26, 2002, to the delight of an enthusiastic crowd, the fighter took to the skies and landed successfully. Many of you might be wondering how these planes became trapped in an icy prison. This story began in 1942. Early in the morning of July 15th, a squadron departed from a secret U.S. Air Force base in Greenland, heading to a British airfield to join the fight against fascism. The squadron consisted of 6 P-38 fighters and 2 B-17 bombers. While flying over the polar ice, they encountered a snowstorm. The pilots were virtually flying blind. A few minutes later, the base sent a message canceling the planned refueling stop in Iceland, forcing the squadron to turn back. Running low on fuel, the pilots decided to make an emergency landing. During the landing, the nose wheel of the first fighter struck a crevasse in the glacier, causing the aircraft to bounce. The snow cushioned the impact, resulting in only minor damage, and the pilot survived. Following this, the remaining planes, with their landing gear retracted, descended one by one. Remarkably, neither the pilots nor the aircraft suffered significant damage. The crew members were rescued, but the planes were left at the emergency landing site. The only mystery in this story is how, over 48 years, a layer of ice over 80 meters thick formed around the plains. In 2008, during diamond mining operations on the coast of Namibia near the town of Oranjemund, geologists stumbled upon something unusual. It was a copper ingot. Initially, it could not be identified, but after a few days, researchers found several more ingots. One of them bore a trident mark. This mark helped determine that the ingots belonged to the Fugger Trading House, one of the wealthiest trade and banking houses of the Renaissance era. The geologists reported their discovery to the Institute of Maritime Archaeology, and within days, excavations began in the area. During the digs, under a 4-meter layer of sand, archaeologists unearthed an ancient ship. After studying it, they determined that this was a Portuguese ship called Bom Jesus, Good Jesus, which was over 400 years old. Naturally, this discovery shocked archaeologists. I'm sure many of you are curious as well. How did a 16th century Portuguese ship end up in Namibia? To answer this, let's recall the history of Portuguese expeditions in search of the Spice Lands, India. The attempts to chart a route to Indian shores began as early as 1415. At that time, King João V of Portugal was not aiming to find the Spice Lands. His goal was the Arab city of Ceuta, located on the African shore of the Strait of Gibraltar. Back then, this trading city was famous for its wealth. On July 25, 1415, two enormous fleets, consisting of 220 ships, set sail from Porto and Lisbon. The military expedition was prepared under the direction of Prince Henry the Navigator, the fifth sword of King João I. On August 20th of that year, the fleets reached the shores of Ceuta and began the assault. The city's inhabitants did not expect an attack, allowing Henry to swiftly conquer this wealthy settlement. During a conversation with captive Moorish merchants, João's son learned many intriguing details that fueled his interest in new travels and conquests. The merchants told Henry about a distant land where spices grew everywhere and rivers full of gemstones flowed. It sounded like a fairy tale, but the Portuguese prince believed it. The merchants revealed that the land could be reached by sailing south along the African coast. This encounter marked the beginning of Portugal's prolonged search for mythical India. In 1484, King João II of Portugal received a proposal from Christopher Columbus to participate in a joint expedition to reach India by sailing west across the Atlantic. However, João II declined, as he planned to reach the desired land by an entirely different route. In 1487, João II sent an expedition southward under the leadership of Bartolomeu Dias. This journey was highly successful, as the explorers managed to discover the Cape of Good Hope and exit the Atlantic Ocean into the Indian Ocean. This proved that Africa did not extend to the pole, as was previously believed. It seemed that India was now within reach, and Bartolomeu Dias's expedition could have continued moving forward. However, due to a lack of knowledge about uncharted territories, sailors of the time believed in various legends. According to one such legend, beyond Africa lay a coiled sea, similar to a swamp, which would suck ships to the bottom. For this reason, the explorers decided not to proceed and returned home. King João II was delighted with the results of the expedition and continued to attempt to reach India, though this did not happen during his reign. His cousin, Manuel I, took up the cause. Under his orders, a new expedition was organized, led by Vasco da Gama. On July 8, 1497, after a prayer service, the expedition members boarded their ships, including Vasco da Gama and Bartolomeu Dias. Cannon fire echoed, and 4 ships departed from Lisbon's port. A week later, the ships reached the Canary Islands. There, the vessels got separated in the fog, but reunited near the Cape Verde Islands. Bartolomeu Dias disembarked to board another ship destined for a new fortress, São Jorge da Mina, on the Guinea coast, where he was appointed governor. The rest of the sailors replenished their water supplies and continued the challenging journey. The ships encountered a series of strong easterly winds that hindered progress along the known route along Africa. Vasco da Gama made a bold decision to turn the ships southwest to bypass the winds. As a result, the expedition veered about 1,500 kilometers from the African coast. The ships traced an arc through the Atlantic Ocean, almost reaching Brazil, which was unknown to them. For nearly 3 months, the sailors did not see land. They had to survive on stale salted meat and brackish seawater, causing many to fall seriously ill. Fortunately, after crossing the equator, the ships caught a favorable wind and reached the Cape of Good Hope. On October 27, 1497, Vasco da Gama's expedition spotted birds and seaweed, indicating that land was nearby. When the ships reached St. Helena Bay, Vasco da Gama ordered a stop. The crew needed to replenish food and water supplies and scrape the ship's hulls clean of barnacles and mollusks. In St. Helena Bay, Vasco da Gama had a conflict with the locals, resulting in his injury and forcing the expedition to leave. Despite this, Vasco da Gama pressed on. On November 22, 1497, the ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope and continued their journey. They encountered a violent storm and barely survived, with one ship severely damaged. It was decided to burn the ship. The remaining 3 ships entered Mossel Bay, South Africa, where they repaired their vessels and resumed their route. Eventually, Vasco da Gama's expedition reached Mozambique. Surprisingly, the locals mistook the sailors for their own people, and their ruler even gifted Vasco da Gama a rosary as a gesture of goodwill. However, Vasco da Gama rejected it, provoking another conflict, forcing the Portuguese to flee once more. On April 8th, the expedition reached the major port of Mombasa in modern Kenya, where they were met with hostility from the Arabs, barely escaping with their lives. Fortunately, on April 14th, at the port of Malindi, Vasco da Gama met a local emir who introduced the expedition to Ahmed ibn Majid, a famous navigator from Oman. He helped guide the Portuguese to India. The journey from East Africa to India's western coast across the Arabian Sea took 23 days. On May 20, 1498, Vasco da Gama's expedition arrived at the Indian city of Calicut. Over 10.5 months, the Portuguese had traveled over 20,000 kilometers, marking a triumphant achievement. Thanks to this expedition, Portugal established trade with India over the following decades. Portuguese ships began sailing the now-known route with increasing frequency. On March 7, 1533, one such trade ship, Bom Jesus, departed Portugal for India. In modern times, no one would have known about it, but the ship encountered a severe storm and sank off the coast of Namibia. In 2008, geologists stumbled upon its remains. A treasure trove was found aboard: firearms, swords, astronomical instruments, 1,845 copper ingots weighing 16 tons, 2 tons of ivory, and several chests filled with gold and silver coins. The treasure's total value is estimated at $14 million, but how did the ship end up buried in desert sands? According to scientists, during the storm, the ship was thrown too close to the shore and struck rocks. Over 500 years, desert winds reshaped the coastline, and the desert expanded, burying the ship under a thick layer of sand until its accidental discovery. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Your engagement is the best reward for me. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.